So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the American Society for Yad Vashem's book club discussion this month. My name is Jonathan Lewis. I'm very pleased and honored to be chairing today's event. A little bit about myself. I was born in Israel to a family that fled the Nazis and came to Palestine as war refugees before the State of Israel was founded. Since then, my family has been committed to memorializing the 6 million victims of the Shoah, as well as to building Israel as a modern nation. My work with Young Leadership Associates of American Society of Yad Vashem brings both of those missions together. Currently, I live in Midtown Manhattan in New York with my husband, and I work as a marketing director here at Revlon in downtown Manhattan. I became involved with American Society for Yad Vashem back in 2019, just before the pandemic. I've always been involved in different charities and was seeking one that fit with my Jewish upbringing and background, as I just explained. And it became clear to me that partnering with Yad Vashem through the American Society of Yad Vashem and YLA would be great, especially when I visited Israel with my husband and went to Yad Vashem, and he was so profoundly overwhelmed by that experience and that story, which is one that as a Jewish person with a strong connection to Israel, I had kind of taken for granted to some degree. And that really opened my eyes to say that the story of the Shoah is something that those Jewish people as well as non-Jewish people need to be reminded of as part of a catastrophic experience for human rights and humanity, quite frankly, beyond just the Jewish people. So the Young Leadership Associates are members of third and fourth generation post-World War II, carrying on the mission of Holocaust awareness, and have undertaken the critical task of developing ongoing programs to connect our contemporaries to Yad Vashem's mission. This group is dedicated to preserving our Shoah legacy by educating others about this critical period in Jewish history and carrying it forward as future leaders. We began the book club in 2018, that's just before I joined YLA, to connect with the Shoah and understand the unique aspect of survivors' stories. These discussions help us never forget, keep lessons, stories, and memories alive. Because of its enormous impact, YLA made the decision to host the discussion, but open it up to the entire American Society for Yad Vashem community. Before I introduce Cheryl Reibel, our terrific author today with her powerful story, which I have over here, Resilience, I want to remind you that the program is recorded, as you saw, but the event is spotlighted mostly on Cheryl and a little bit on myself here in the upfront. If you have questions during the presentation that you'd like shared, please share them in the chat box. Miriam or I will prompt Cheryl to answer. And that brings us to Cheryl, who is part of our Southeast region here in the United States. Cheryl Reibel grew up surrounded by survivors of the Holocaust in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Her childhood brimmed with their tales of faith and fear and endurance. Her parents, aunts, uncles, her neighbors, all of them were survivors. Cheryl went on to study journalism and public relations at NYU and spent a semester at Tel Aviv University studying history. She received her certificate in human behavior from the New School in New York City. Throughout her career, she drew strength from the stories of her extended survivor family and passed on that strength to those she helped. After volunteering at an inner city high school helping young people transition into adult life, she came to realize that her stories were more than the lived experience of individual survivors. They had the power to inspire other people to survive as well. As she grew up, no story could ever compare to what she heard around the dining room table and in the little park across the street from her school, told by people she thought of as her own family. Resilience, this book, which hopefully you all had a chance to order, if not, you can after the meeting, is a book of illustrated poetry written by Cheryl, and each poem is based on one of those stories that were lived by those friends and family. These are real stories, and each one is dear to her heart because they are the ones she heard as a child and felt so compelled to share. The 37 poems capture and invoke the innocence and inner strength of the children surviving even as Nazis sought to crush both their hope and their lives. The book and the Resilience Project seeks to keep the stories of these incredible survivors alive by connecting the past and the present. It's my pleasure to now introduce Cheryl, who will take us through her beautiful book. And before so, she'll tell us a little bit about those stories and that background, and a little bit about what inspired her to write Resilience. So Cheryl, I'll pass it on to you for a little of that, and then we'll actually show some slides from the book itself.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank Yad Vashem for their education, research, and documentation of the Holocaust, and that you have over 1 million visitors per year. And hopefully that'll change people's opinions of what happened to us and of the Jewish people. I created this book, Resilience, because everybody knew about the Holocaust at not everybody, most people knew about the Holocaust, that 6 million died, Jewish people died, and that was it. And it sounded like we were victims, just walking into gas chambers and things like that. And I felt like we needed stories about people who are partisans and hiding, who fought, who had strength. And my book has 37 stories because 18 is high. So it's 18 plus 18, and that equals a young new generation. So that was a cause of that. Both my parents are survivors, and they each have different stories. One was a partisan and the other one was saved by a righteous Gentile. So it was a lot of strength that I grew up with. And I wanted to write about their stories. My mother was in hiding in the woods. And before she got there, she was in a ghetto. And they were forced into a ghetto, which was a walled off area, somewhat like a prison camp. And from there, in the ghetto, she found out about the onslaught that was going to happen in a week. She was working in one of the offices. So quickly, they all got together and they decided what they would do is build a tunnel out of the ghetto. So they started digging slowly where people wouldn't notice in the back of one of the bunkers. And what they did was they put mud into their socks, which is one of the stories. And slowly, once it was built to get out, the night before the onslaught, they got out of the ghetto and ran into the forest. In the forest, they were saved by partisans, the Bilski brothers. Their stories depicted in the movie Defiance, 2008. And they found them in the woods and had them join their community. They had about 200 people there. And they lived the daily life of 4 years. They had Jewish holidays, they had celebrations. They tried to live as normal as possible there. The Russians traded for food for them, for whatever the Bilski brothers could find. And they existed in the woods. After the war, they escaped the woods, walked for 3 days in the water, and then were taken in by, they found some people that took them into Hayas, and then they went to a displaced person in Italy camp for 3 years. After that, through friends and family, they were given a place to go back to, which was New York. And there they lived in a room of 10 people. And from that, they all had courage, resilience. They had the ability to cope. They got jobs. They became successful. They supported Israel and the museum. And they grew their families. And out of the 200 people that were in the woods, there's over 1,600 descendants at this point. So that's my mother's story. My father's story was saved, his family, 2 sisters and 1 brother and himself were saved by a neighbor who was a righteous Gentile. and actually has a tree at Yad Vashem. She was a neighbor and she liked the family very much. And she saw the war was going to start. So she took the two sisters, hid them in her attic. She was married to a Nazi, sent away her own child to live with the cousin so she wouldn't say anything. And when her husband, the Nazi, would leave for the day, she would knock up on the attic for the two sisters to come down and just get to stretch their legs for about 5 minutes and go back up. In order to keep them busy, they were about 12 and 14 at the time. She gave them scraps of handkerchiefs and any kind of rags that she could find and some needles. And they crocheted beautiful, beautiful flowers and pictures of things they could remember. They stayed up there for about 4 years. She hid them. And at the same time, my father and his brother were hiding nearby in a grave in a cemetery. And every night, one of them would sneak out to get the garbage and the food that she left outside for them from the house. They risked their lives for that. So then they all survived after the war. They got out. They reunited. And at that point, one sister moved to Israel because she fell in love with a gentleman from Palestine, one to Denver, and my father and brother moved to Brooklyn and then on to New Jersey. And they all vowed that one day they'll meet again. So when I was about 7, my father brought over the righteous Gentile to live with us for about a year. Thought they'd show her America and she would get to see all the sights. But instead, she wanted to see the two sisters also, who they brought over. And they spent about a week together. And all she wanted to do was cook for them. So we had pierogi every night for dinner. And then after they left, she continued cooking for about a year. I won't say how much weight I gained, but she insisted on not feeding garbage. So that's a story of the end story of my father being saved by a righteous Gentile.
Let me jump in here, Cheryl, for 1 second. I mean, I think what I'd love to do now is if you're okay with it, is put up the slideshow, because I think what would be so powerful is to see how some of these stories that you touched on about the ghetto and about running, and hiding, and how that's come to life in your book. So if that's okay, maybe we can play the slideshow.
Sure.
So
the book was called Resilience. And that's because the definition is the ability to recover or adjust easily to misfortune and a change. The first page is a poem or a story about when you had to start wearing a patch of a star to be identified as a Jew. So these are the dresses that they had sitting on the chair. And one of the children, these are all stories that were written in the style of the child telling the story as opposed to the adult. And the story goes that mom says it's fun. We'll wear the same dress every day with a beautiful patch of a star. Wow, everyone's matching, soon we'll all play games. We're all on the same team. The children were aware of what's going on, but really not aware of what's going on. And it's the innocence of the child and the resilience of the parent to keep the child going. Now, the Nazis started closing up the stores and taking them away in the area that they were living. And it turned out that my mother had a clothing store. And, well, my grandmother had a clothing store. This is about my mother. And they used to play bride and mother inside the store. So this is how this follows. It says the big store window is the same as they looked in. That used to be us, a mother and daughter dancing. She's dressed up as a bride, falling out of her dress and shoes. That used to be us. One day we will dance. I'll be the bride wearing the dress and shoes. That will be us.
So Cheryl, let me actually pause here for 1 second. I have just two questions that maybe would be helpful as we go through these slides. One is, can you speak a bit about the artwork that's accompanying the poems and a little bit about your journey? I see you teamed up with McLean Fletcher. Could you tell us a bit about who that person is and how that came to be?
Oh, sure. Well, it's very interesting backstory of the artist. I had hired her to paint my house.
Mm-hmm.
And we started talking and she asked what's going on and what I'm doing. So I said, I'm writing some stories of young people in the Holocaust. And she said to me, what is the Holocaust?
Mm.
It turned out that she was raised in a small area in Pennsylvania, and they never learned what the Holocaust was. And I thought she would be the perfect person to interpret the poems so everyone could understand them and see the illustration, that it was just not depicted for Jewish people to understand. So she did the illustrations and she got very involved in Holocaust education. Actually, she won an award for contemporary art. And then she was an aspiring actress as well. And she never got a part. And then she was given a part at the JCC to show the anguish of a woman who had to give away her child during the Holocaust and where it would go.
Wow.
So just one person was profoundly changed by learning about the Holocaust and what goes on. So
Wow.
really, that's her backstory.
That's very powerful. And one of the other things I thought was very powerful was you've included a foreword by Alexander Vasely, who's the grandson of Dr. Viktor Frankl, who has a very well-known and established book that I've come to learn many people have read during times of despair, and Man's Search for Meaning is the title of that. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, one, if you could touch a bit on that forward, but two is, I've noticed a lot in your poems, there is this sense that, to your point of the children having awareness, that there's optimism. Here, I will be the bride, that will be us. On the prior slide, if you don't mind going back, Miriam, I think it says, soon we will all play games. So I've noticed this pattern in your poems, that there's always a sense of tomorrow will be better. Is that something that you've injected in this, or is that how your family experienced their time during the Shoah?
I believe, and the purpose of this book is really to show hope and strength.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what was depicted here. I feel like my parents and all these other people that I met just shared their childhood, helped each other, and that was very important.
And how did you team up with Alexander Vasely for this, the foreword?
That was very interesting. My book was sent anonymously to Vienna over to Alexander, the grandson of Viktor Frankl, thinking that he would be interested in reading it. Before I knew it, I was having FaceTime videos with him. He asked to write the foreword because of his experience and about his grandfather, who was in 4 different camps, and that he held strength because he felt like human dignity was very important. And Alexander felt that he only learned about his grandfather when he was 19, and he couldn't believe this because he was a wonderful man with a sense of humor, drove him around, told him stories, but did not include the stories of the war. And finally, Alexander found out about Man's Search for Meaning. He read the book and was really astounded that 5 million copies were sold. So we continued on as friends, and he opened a center not only in Vienna, but in Los Angeles about logotherapy, which is something that Viktor Frankl invented. And the whole thing is that we all should have purpose in life to get through it. And respect for humanity. So
Wow,
that's how he came along.
That's quite.
It was nice. It was all
yeah.
young people that joined in with me.
Yeah, I thought the foreword was definitely a good tone to set about, very connected to your topic of resilience and this concept of everybody having their own Auschwitz or their own dark moment. And that leads me to I know you've had some chats with different partners here with ASYV and YLA and whatnot, and you've talked a little bit about your own experience in targeting, wanting to bring this to children and to the next generation, and even about your experiences at the Washington Museum with children maybe being disinterested or texting. Can you speak about what your hope is with this book and with that young audience, and how you can break through some of that kind of just typical child disinterest or lack of connection with the subject matter?
Well, there was a lot to read in the Holocaust Museum.
Mm-hmm.
The kids were kind of getting overwhelmed, and they saw a few exhibits, and then they tried listening to long videos of survivors, and they had trouble with that with the accent.
Mm-hmm.
But they went through the museum pretty quickly, and then they were sitting in the front texting.
Mm-hmm.
And I went over to them and said, "Why are you texting? Why aren't you inside?" And they said, "Well, we went through the museum already." And they did quite quickly, because unfortunately 11-year-old's attention span isn't that great. So what I did was I decided to put the book in stories, and each story be 30 words or less, so it would look like a text to them. So that's why I had to fit the stories into such short pieces, so their attention span would be there. And it was. And it's been tested. The Holocaust Museum bought quite a bit, not bought, it was donated quite a bit to the bookstore. I had received 3 anonymous grants just from writing letters to people, which was really nice. One was for an older audience of sororities and fraternities, and the 2 were for Holocaust education in schools. It became a nonprofit, and anything goes to Holocaust education, even the cost of the book. Originally, it was a hardcover book, an art book, and then I switched it to a small, soft covered so kids could put it in their backpacks and things like that. Next to each one of these illustrations is an empty page. And the page was left empty so the student can write anything they feel or relate to. Yeah. So a lot of the teachers passed out pencils, colored pencils, crayons, and they depicted their own stories in relation to the poem. The teachers and parents, it was a tool, actually, a hidden tool for teachers and parents to identify any kids that were having trouble with bullying and isolation and things like that, that they found in the stories, not being recognized, not being part of a group. And they, the teachers and the parents then knew how to handle the child. There were 4 suicides that were prevented because of the book, because of the alienation and isolation. So I felt like that was a great tool. Now, I also created the book that it could be taught as art, history, and poetry. So in schools that didn't really push on Holocaust education, I let them use another form or modality in order to put it into their system. And the teachers were very good at that, and the principals were good at that, because not every state is it mandatory, and not every country is it mandatory.
So question for you, Cheryl, about the stories. At what point in your life experience, growing up in this community in New Jersey with so many of these, mind-blowing stories of survival and enduring, did you realize you wanted to document them and at some point share them in your own way. Is that something you knew as a young person, or did that come later for you?
Well, my mother always spoke at museums, groups of people, kids, schools, political events, and things like that. And she really pushed, never forget and never let something like this happen again. So before she died, she asked me to continue on what she had done. And one very cute story about her is she met then Vice President Biden. And he started talking to her, and she interrupted and said, "You need to talk to me with a lot of pride and dignity because I'm a Holocaust survivor. And I want you to mention that where we are now, that we're in front of a group, because we survived, we had strength, and we want to teach that on to others. And we really want it to be taught in your schools as well. And I'll be happy to go around and teach it." So that was just cute, because Vice President Biden was trying to talk about other things, and my mother kept on pinching him and saying, "You better tell my story." So that was it.
Speaking of, thank you for that, of bringing this to new generations. I mean, obviously, we all know, and unfortunately, it's always been a part of the Jewish experience, but there is, an uptick in hate out there in the world and anti-Semitism. And I even was reading an article in the Atlantic, in this month's Atlantic, that, Holocaust education might even have a negative perception. And, I think you started your story talking about, the sense that Jews were just kind of willingly victimized and things like that. In your experience with bringing this book out and bringing it in front of children, when you get over maybe the impatience or the, low attention span, do you find that children, especially non-Jewish children, how do they take to this subject matter? You mentioned that it was able to help some people from suicide. Can you elaborate a bit on that, and the universal message of this, which I think is something that as somebody as YLA, that I'm curious to help be a part of, is to make the experience of Holocaust more than just about a Jewish experience, but about, to your point, resilience and fighting through darkness. So if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I guess it all started when I was teaching transition in inner city school. I found that a lot of slavery was being brought up, and that the kids were grandkids of slaves and things like that. And they looked at me like, who is this Jewish woman coming in, Caucasian Jewish woman coming in to help us as a volunteer, kind of looking down at me and telling me, really pushing me about slavery. And I said, "Excuse me," to the class, "I'd like to tell you about my parents and about what happened during the Holocaust." And I outlined the years and how many people and things like that. And they became very, very interested. And then all of a sudden, they wanted to know about Jewish holidays and what they meant, because I would bring in food on Jewish holidays. And I think the whole experience changed for them, because my parents' story was about strength and someone from another religion saving them.
Mm-hmm.
So slavery was still there, but it wasn't the prime thing they talked about anymore. And then the head priest of this school called me down, and I was thinking, okay, I have to be quiet now. He's gonna fire me, even though I was a volunteer. And I sat down with him, and he said, "You know what? I want you to teach this to every class, because it's important for them to learn what the Jewish people went through in order to make some sort of bridge between these inner city kids and the Jewish population." And I found that all of a sudden, Christian schools were ordering it for their high schools, other religions were ordering it. And I went to speak to them as well. And it is a universal tone of victimization, isolation, and everyone really fell for it.
Have you
not fell for it, but related to it?
Have you experienced, especially in front of non-Jewish audiences, and other, I mean, not just maybe young people being rude or something, but anything where you felt there's really strong sense of denial or refusing to accept that this happened? Has that been part of your process? Have you encountered that in any kind of meeting?
Yes, I did. I
Mhm.
did. And through that, I really used Yad Vashem because you had true documentation, not just stories.
Mhm.
So I used that as a tool, and many things that you had written and many documents that you have, and the Holocaust Museum as well. We went on a trip to the Holocaust Museum, which they had never done before.
In the US, in Washington,
Yes,
right?
yes. And they learned. And then we just went through more stories that were there, and they were interested. But they were interested in documentation more than stories, because there they realized that it really did happen.
Mhm. So you're saying that potentially the stories potentially were just, when they saw the realities, the documentation, the photos, it was harder to deny or to evade or something, whereas maybe the stories had a little bit of a disconnect for them. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah,
True documentation really changes everything.
for sure.
So I even brought in 2 of the crocheted rags that my aunts had made in the attic,
Mhm.
and they all were able to see them. I'm saving them for my girls' kuppahs, and after that, they'll be donated to the museum.
So I know I want to make sure that if the audience also that's listening has any questions, that they know that they're welcome to put them in the chat box. I have a few more questions, but I want to make sure that is shared. How often, Cheryl, do you get in front of audiences, young or old, whether it's something like this book club or some of the work with the museums or the schools? How often are you able to actually represent this work and present it?
Oh, I've done it quite a few times. It's been about, believe it or not, 60 or 70 schools,
Oh, wow.
embassies that are looking at it for their countries. It's already been translated into German. And the embassy, the education person of the embassy is bringing it back to Germany about its approval.
Wow.
So it's just been wonderful, to tell you the truth. And now we're doing a teacher education program where the teachers themselves will be able to use the book as a tool. So it's this tiny little book has really gotten far in a lot of backpacks, in a lot of kids' stories, in a lot of adults' hands. Adults are more emotional about the story because they relate to it more. And I was surprised that even adults went for the book. I was carrying about 24 books in the street in Washington, D.C., where I was living at the time. And it was on the corner. People would come up to me and say, "What are you holding? That cover is really beautiful." So I would tell them, and people would give me money for the books, which
Yeah,
was really odd.
the illustrations are terrific. I actually, the story of it, how they came to be, and the fact that it's a non-Jewish person that really brought them to life, I think lends them that much more power. And one question I had for you is, during your journey of writing this book, was there anything either similar to this or even different that really was an inspiration for you, or almost like a model or a template that helped you? And I'm just curious, even for my own education, is there something, and for the audience, that you'd recommend and say really impacted you as you put this together, either a collection of poems or a particular story? I mean, there's so many, but was there one or two that really impacted you in your process?
The stories that I really got into were really stories of strength, the partisan, survival, things like that. So that's just, and the documentation of my parents. I really recommend people to record as much as they can, even if their own parents talking about their parents talking about it, and just making more documentation of it. Writing was done on napkins and airplanes and just driving. I would pull over and write a story. I would try to remember them as much as possible. And if they had the chance to meet a survivor, it would be great if they just sat down with them, listened to their story, and get a story of strength for themselves. So I feel that as much written down and recorded is really important. I was really lucky just this past weekend. I was in a synagogue in Palm Beach, and there was this very old man and his wife. And I just went over to his wife and said that, thank God this man is alive, and he was 99 years old. So I went over and talked to the wife because the man is not that coherent at this point. And it turned out to be one of the Bielski brothers that saved my mother.
Wow.
And the other 199 people in the woods. And he's the only survivor, and that he was one of the brothers. So it was just unbelievable to see him and meet him, thank him, and just know that the story is still alive. And that's from 70 years ago.
How long, Cheryl, was the process to write? Like, I see it was copyright in 2019. When did you start and putting this together? Did this happen in a short time or over many years?
Oh, no. Well, it was kind of short in writing the poetry because the stories were easy to remember. But I wanted to pick out very hopeful and stories of strength from some of the stories that I heard. So there's only a few in concentration camps, but it talked about their strength and their experience in the camp and things that they did just to work to stay together. And just strength and inspiration that I want everyone to get from the book.
So what I think we could do, because we're nearing, maybe we could put the slideshow back up, and maybe Cheryl, if you're comfortable, you could take the audience through reading a couple more, because I think the to your point, the power of the stories and the drawings, I want to make sure that we kind of leave on that note. And then I have just a couple of closing remarks about upcoming events and things of that sort.
Sure. This slideshow is special. This slide, it was an orphan train that went to New Zealand that was sponsored by a Gentile man as well. He was a lord there. And his whole idea was saving 733 orphans. And that's what he found there. And he took them in. And the words are, they want us 733, no families, no homes, no brothers and sisters, comfy seats, open windows, toilets, and doors. I love the name New Sweetland, they want us. Now, what's interesting about this is New Zealand only has 10,000 Jews living there at this time. And by saving these 733, he brought them to Wellington. And out of the 10,000, 6,000 of them live in Wellington. And most of them are descendants.
Wow.
So, and there are other orphans, of course, that were saved by other countries as well. And it's just to show that the orphans did know their situation, but didn't really know their situation, but knew that they would be saved. And they were placed in beautiful homes of people, not in orphan homes and things like that.
I love that one. I love that one also because of the bright color. Again, the optimism that is throughout this book, right? Taking something that could be so, like, obviously it's heavy, but something that could be so almost hard to see the bright, but even there, the bright colors and that hope and that optimism, even that story that you're telling, that this work of this man and these orphans is now a real community of people living a life. It's incredible.
Thank you. The idea is the book is sweet and sour, so to speak. It's sweet because the children knew that they were going to get out. They had no idea that the Holocaust will just go on and on. They knew it was for a set period of time. And one population, which is really interesting, and then I'll explain this side, is the Girls Scouts and Boy Scouts used the book for COVID, knowing that their isolation was just for a period of time. So they really related to some of these stories and they resonated with them and their families. So I was happy. It was a tool used for everyone at the same time they learned about the Holocaust. So this last slide is one of the last slides. It shows that the gates were open. So I'll read it to you if you'd like.
Yes, please.
And it says, home is at last. They found their home. They went back to their home. Of course, it was occupied, but they saw it. They asked to come in. And it's home at last, just to see through the locked gate, through closed doors, asked to go inside, touch the walls. Windows are closed. I smile. No locked gate, no closed doors, no walls, no closed windows. All is open to go anywhere. And that was last hope. Now, the refugees are actually looking at this now at the UN to use this as a t-shirt.
Wow.
So I'm telling you, this little book really resonates.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful book and that you've created. I'm very glad to have been exposed to it. You've definitely given us a lot to think about, and I think we're at the point where, unless there's something else you want to add to our audience, I'll kind of wrap this up. But I do want to thank you for putting this together. It's something that I want to gift to young people in my life, Jewish and non-Jewish, and I'm very optimistic that we'll be seeing a lot more of this book in places we might not even expect. So I don't know, Cheryl, if there's anything else you want to add before or anybody from ASYV before I wrap this up.
Well, I'm disappointed in the way about the growth of anti-Semitism. And I know Yad Vashem and other groups are really trying to bring it down. So I just feel that the more people know about things and know about our strength, and that young people, as you, the second and third generation, really understand that it could happen again. Hope it won't happen again, but because we're so strong, but it could, things like this just prop up and happen again. I just want one little story and then we'll put it away. My daughter went to the international school in Washington, D.C., and it was mix of all different religions, races, countries. And she was the only Jewish child in her class. And when it was time to do the prom, they said, oh, okay, you're the Jew, you'll be the treasurer. And here it was in this decade, modern century life, that people still depict Jews in different ways that are not complimentary. And people just remember the stories of Jews having horns and they're separated and they look different and things like that. But in this instance, they were pointing out how smart they are, but that they were money lenders at the time, which was also depicted in The Merchant of Venice. So I'm hoping that stories like that could be combated a little bit, and it's up to the new generations to do that. That's it.
So totally hear you. And again, thank you for your inspiring presentation. It's really a blessing for our whole community, both Jewish and non, to have this book. And just wanted to make a couple announcements about upcoming YLA activities for those who are interested. on the West Coast in Los Angeles. The concert for Sugihara will be held May 18th at UCLA's Royce Hall. It was at Carnegie Hall in New York in April. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend it. Lira Auerbach's Symphony No. 6, Vessel of Light, tells the story of a Japanese diplomat and his rescue of thousands of Jews in Lithuania during the Holocaust. The tickets are free, but there's special benefits for ASYV donors. You can check out the website for more. There's also a YLA Shabbat dinner in New York a week from Friday that my husband and I will be going to at the Jewish Center on 86th Street in New York City. For those in the YLA demographic, we would love for you to come out and join. I was at the Shabbat dinner in the fall, which was very powerful experience. So I highly recommend those that can join. And if you're interested in becoming more involved and helping, as Cheryl said, combat ignorance and hate, and memorialize this terrible chapter in history, please reach out to one of the regional directors. I know they're on the line here as well, and they'll be putting in email addresses into the chat. So Cheryl, again, thank you. I don't know if there's anything else. I know you left us with some very powerful words. But if you have anything else, please share. And otherwise, thank you, everybody, and wishing you a good afternoon.
Okay, and whoever wants to get the book, you go on readresilience.com. And you can find it there. And again, it all goes to Holocaust education, just like all of you are doing.
Terrific. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be getting more copies. I'm going to try to get you, Cheryl, to get it on Amazon.
Yeah, working on that. I hope so.
Jonathan, Nava,
Yes.
Did you have a question? Can we unmute Miriam? Nava Lewis? No relation, maybe relation.
A relation, a mother.
Oh, there you go. Yay. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, just wanted to say this. I was very moved by this book for all the reasons that you are covering such a wide scope in such a small, concise version. And I found the art and the poetry really amazing. And I think reaching young people now, the next generations. I mean, my parents, as Jonathan said, were survivors and keeping this alive. And I think you did a beautiful, beautiful job, and I commend you for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, so I think that concludes our meeting. So hopefully, if you haven't bought the book, please do so. If you're having trouble finding it, reach out to the contacts that have been provided in the chat box. And I know there'll be more book clubs coming up. So we look forward to seeing you more, or in New York at the Shabbat dinner, or in LA at the concert. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you both.
Okay.
Thank you.